Carina Zona. I've been a developer for about 15 years, and I have another job as well. In addition to being a developer, I'm also a sex educator. And I think a lot about how these two worlds overlap, and they do, quite a bit. Imagine walking through the world knowing that everyone's first assumptions about how you see yourself, who you love, what feels right for you, that they're all completely wrong. Now imagine signing up for that cool website and then being required to select an option from a drop-down menu that doesn't include anything that represents you. You'll feel defeated. You'll want to argue that whatever they think they're learning from that drop-down menu, it's not really true. You'll want to tell them that they're adding to your humiliation by making you do this. You'll want to tell them that they're missing a huge part of you. Users have been giving pushback to assumptions that don't fit their world, that leave them out. Social apps in particular are being pressed to adjust. Facebook, Google, many others, they've been dealing with these problems for years, and they still have not worked it out. So if you feel out of depth, it's okay, because they certainly do. When developers talk about normalization, we're talking about databases. But when we deal with human attributes, we're really pursuing a very different cause, sociological normalization. And that is a construction of a social norm, our sense of what is normal and right. And when we conflate those two things, that can work fine if you only want users who we can select from that sort of small, idealized norm. But most of us don't fit that, which means most of us are going to be selected out. What we lose track of is one of those core objectives of database normalization. We're supposed to be mirroring real-world concepts and their interrelationships. When the database is in tension with people's own reality, then it's not people who need to be flexible, it's us. Why is that hard? At first glance, this stuff seems pretty easy until we actually try it. It's just forms, right? Forms. And we've done those a million times. But then we get tripped up by a few flawed premises. A premise that the deeply personal stuff about humans can be reduced to nice, neat lists. A premise that deeply personal stuff about human beings can be reduced to those lists. Second, we have an assumption that there must be canonical lists for who human beings are. And at least if they're not, we can create them, right? And then we have this third problem, which is our faith that those first two can just be easily solved by adding more list items, which I think doesn't fully work. So this just makes us risk looking like a dumbass. Maybe funny, but a dumbass. And then, of course, people always question just how right you are. So we've got this flawed premise that we intuitively understand the nature of social networks, that when we step aside from that word, social networking, and how it's been implemented, what is an actual social network? What is that in purely human terms? Ask yourself. As developers, we're building or we're breaking community with each line of code. And those one-to-one relationships that we want to be fostering between the individual and the app. So what are those relationships that we are inhibiting between individuals? In real life, I know you better than you is so presumptuous, but we do it. In real life, your existence just isn't possible, just sounds so clueless, but we do that too. And in real life, who you are is invalid, sounds so arrogant. We do them all. It's not what we set out to do. It's not the community we seek to build. We want to create things that feel cutting edge, not out of touch. We're supposed to be conservative in what we do and liberal in what we accept from others. So how do we bring those modern, real human realities into the data, the views, the logic? And where we start with that is at schema level. As developers, we're tugged in these two opposite poles, these directions. We want to keep the code base manageable, right? And yet we do want to design for reality, for complexity. So we need to get those two schemas, the mental and the database, into alignment. This is what we think of as the start of a schema, right? This is a migration. But we've got two different kinds. We've got the mental, which is our set of preconceived ideas about the world. It's our own personal framework for representing an aspect of the world. It's that system we have for organizing and perceiving and sorting the information that we see. And then there's that database schema, and it's basically the exact same thing, manifest in the database. But remember, it's the individual's idea of the real world that's being manifest in that database. So here's some examples of what individuals think the world looked like. They're all taking really good shots. Schemas, though, are a foundation for expressing things that are much more deeply intimate. They're our foundation for expressing our own self-image, our identity, our important relationships, our own values, definitely our spirit and creativity and uniqueness. And these are all defining user experience as well, which is something that we can fix. We can choose to fix our schemas for the sake of creating a user experience at the front end. So how do we do that? We ask a simple question: what benefit is the user going to notice? Because that's not equivalent to what do we think the user will benefit? How do we think this will be good for them? Because that's a question that's going to grant us a lot of latitude for assuming that we already know what they want and we can deliver it, and whatever we have that's cool will be that thing. Evaluating from that user perspective gives us more focus. So there's no point on this chart where everyone is going to see that kind of maximum benefit. But what we can do is look at options and trade-offs as we develop. So titles. Titles of people, Mr., Mrs. It seems trivial, but it can be an important part of your human and social identity. Mr., Mrs., Ms., Doctor. We know that most people, a good solid majority, are going to identify with one of these. But we also do realize that the world has more complex possibilities, that there's much more variety than that, but it's also hard to know what to do. So this is British Airways. Wait. We're only on D. We'll get there. These are all legit. Okay, they cheated a little bit at the end there. All right, so these were all legitimate things in need that they were trying to serve. That's 133 in case you didn't get to count them all. It's hard to know what to prioritize among these, and definitely it's hard to know apparently where to stop. So British Airways took another try at this. So all those royalty people pretty much seem to be left out, except for some reason barons, baronesses, and viscounts. I don't know what's up with that. So there's a whole lot of titled people who suddenly are no longer acknowledged. But that's a company making a trade-off. It's a decision that they decided to sacrifice that positive experience for those few people in order to continue, or rather to stop continuing making a negative experience for the many. However, we still have a flaw. This is Grace Hopper. I bet some people know who she is. All right, so Mrs., Ms., we can leave it up to a user to select the one that fits their identity. We even know what hers was. She preferred Mrs. Personal identity can have more than one facet, and we're compelling this person to whittle it down to just one because she's also a doctor. One personhood, one accomplishment, that's all you get. If we change this to a multi-select, we could give a better implementation, a little more accessibility to say this is who I am and this is what I've done in my life. But it gets even trickier because I don't see many lists that also have Rear Admiral in them. We seriously have to consider the value of that crazy British Airways list. Because if you combine something of that realm with a multi-select, we start to get closer to the real world. So thinking at the outset about the real world's variety, its complexity, it starts us just asking questions. It sets a foundation for social app building. What user experience is being driven here? Where is this taking us to? Maybe that title becomes a one-to-many. Maybe it needs to be a string attribute so we don't have to predict every label that exists in the world. It's easy to say just like, we'll refactor one of them later. Don't worry about it. But those initial choices, they are differing user experiences, and they're being set in motion right from the beginning. So we have checkboxes, radio buttons, select menus. Those are all really constrained options. We're telling you who you possibly could be. And that always implies that all real-world examples, all real-world possibilities are represented, that we knew them. We're saying, hey, user, you get to pick just one. It's the real world being rejected. It didn't match up with our personal mental schema. Checking a box is that one-step action, and entering a text string is not, and there's accessibility issues with that and inconvenience with that. So having something that's free-form solution is also not without its flaws, and definitely doesn't feel exciting. Nevertheless, it can deliver some real benefits for users and for us. This is MetaFilter, social site. Identity has been a series of text fields for them for years, over a decade by now. And there were initially people who were absolutely horrified at just the mere idea of this. There are a lot of developers using MetaFilter. And then they really discovered that they got over it very quickly. They jumped on board. They loved the possibilities. And because they could express this personal dimension of themselves with authentic, full voice, they got into it. And that text field has become a beloved institution of MetaFilter. When a user puts in something in that field, they're saying something revealing about themselves, something personal, individualistic, that they're allowed to say anything they want is saying something revealing about MetaFilter itself and the community that's being created around it. That schema is trusting users, and that's a foundation for creating the UX behind all that. It's about trust. They trust us, and we trust them. So MetaFilter users got trusted with more and more fields over the years. And one of the things about having those fields is you can put any damn thing you wanted to it, even completely ridiculous, useless values, because it's not the point. The point isn't data, it's expression. So Robert Frost says that home is the place where they have to take you in. And social apps intend to be the place that you want to go home to. A place where we always feel welcome. We aspire to that, right? And we can do that by making development choices that do say, we get it, be individual, be messy, throw your clothes around. We can handle you being you. So when we collect data on people, we're in a different realm at this point. We're in the social sciences. And if you want to run useful analytics about personal attributes and behavior, then social data collection gets much more complex, and it needs to meet at least 2 minimum criteria. That field's values have to have every possible option. Social science, they say, exhaustive and exclusive. Mutually exclusive just means that it's not possible for any of those labels to overlap at all. So can you think of any social app whatsoever that manages to cover just those two? And we've seen this kind of stuff enough. And it seems like a really good cover-all bases kind of thing. And then we find out there's a lot more options of people who identify with a lot more ways of labeling themselves and being perceived. And they're not even consistent. So we never get there by adding more list items. It's never going to work. It's not about keeping up. And that's fine, because instead we can choose to look at that very human personal data from a really different perspective. Rather than getting into that habit of structuring data for easy analysis, we can step back, we can wallow in that personal user experience, and just treat data as something that's sheerly expressive. It has character, it has individualism, it has distinctiveness. It is just me alone. And of course, we do have a problem with this. And it's fair to say that this approach does wreak chaos on some of our other objectives, one of them being internationalization. There's a lot of objection to not collecting nice, structured gender data, for instance, because this really messes with pronouns. Don't go there. It's hell. You're never going to solve this problem with pronouns, because pronouns are really complex in English and get so much worse in other languages. You don't get to just intuit from who a person identifies, what gender they have, with language. So this isn't our safety net. It's not useful for us. Maybe you've heard of Randall Munroe. He's better known as the author of XKCD. He's also a physicist, and he has a very crazy blog called What If, in which he addressed serious questions like, what is the weight of the world? One of the questions he has asked with quite a bit of seriousness is how to deal with pronouns in English language projects. He was building an IRC chatbot and put in, as he usually does, an extremely large amount of research. And what he concluded is that you just can't. Ask what gender pronouns they actually prefer. That's the most reasonable, useful thing that he could possibly come up with. All right, so you see that third one, right? They, them, and you're trying to imagine calling someone a they. We keep getting told by our teachers that that's bad English, that it's ignorant, you can't use it. Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Chaucer, they were fine with it. It's a legit use, and even Facebook uses it, so just tell people who think that that's not okay, you're fine. You can avoid the whole situation, or else you can ask people. Otherwise, you're just going straight down a rabbit hole. So we have this vision as developers of what a code base should be, what it should not be, what makes a code base good. And the most sensible ways that we can arrive at solutions that are at least truthy tend to be far removed from real life utility. So we have all these ideas about what we want. Stuff that's structured, easy to use, easy to maintain, that we can apply for analytics, predicting behavior, for making good business decisions, for being profitable. And then we do so much work that we don't need to be doing. Doing validations. If we just let people be whoever they say they are, we don't need to validate at all. We don't need to test about those validations either. We're doing really premature optimization. And then we miss the point, because there's so much variability in terms of culture, individual, and always changing. Not just as a cultural thing, but I'm changing, you're changing. The way we identify today isn't going to keep on being consistent. So we're making these decisions on ridiculously false premises. So there's a survey called ERIS that's put on as part of the census, and it's the largest ongoing survey of Americans' religious identification. And it just asks one simple question: what is your religion, if any? Nice and open-ended. And they got about 100 unique answers from that. And if you're trying to make a form out of that, you remember that the one we laughed at had 133, so 100 is going to get us right back into trouble. So there's really not a way to approach this with a form that's going to make it easy for users, especially trying to pick out from just that many possibilities. So ERIS found that with a little work that they could tweak that down to 13 major categories. This was starting to sound a little bit more reasonable, a little more manageable. We could probably put that in a form, right? But the thing is, you can look at those and say a lot of those people, it's such a small number, they're really just edge cases. And, we want to focus on the major things, right? We always say like, it's an edge case. So we can filter it down a bit. At least a quarter of all those people were Christian, so, we got that covered. Pretty much every other religion would just kind of be that clutter, those edge cases. And we've got some sort of crummy data here, these are nils, blanks. We can get rid of those. So now we're starting to fix up some stuff here, starting to get useful data. And it's focusing attention on a real problem, which is that 1 in 5 of those answers from an advertiser's perspective, from a customer perspective, they don't want them. Those aren't useful to them. So now we've got a useful list. Now we know what to do. Covers all of the big categories. And when you get reductive enough, American religion is a binary. Booyah, this is so great. We only have to have a Boolean. But of course, we would not do this. We know this is offensive. We know this is useless. The advertisers who say, don't give me all that other edge case, crappy, blank data, would also be really pissed to have something this vague. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people who'd be pissed about being asked that question in that way. So what we're learning is that people just aren't edge cases. Every one of them is somehow got to be factored in to be useful. And that's why they're pushing back, because we do reductive all the time, and it just doesn't scale up. But we get instinctually uncomfortable with leaving structured data. It's nice and easy, it lines up. It's very easy to do relations on it. It feels right. It feels right to me too. It freaks me out a little bit to start wandering off. Like all this talk about NoSQL and document stores. Don't be crazy. But we still have that foundational question of, from the user's perspective, what benefit are they going to see? What are they going to be perceiving? What identity? And we can strike some middle grounds on that. We can give a guided response rather than auto-suggest that's always constrained to just what we suggest. We can step back a little bit, give them a few values that we think are the most common, the most preferred, and then step back as soon as they start typing in something else. Let them go for it. So that really gives us compromise of structured data for those who just, they know exactly what they want to put in. And then we've got something really free form and open to that expressiveness for the people who want that option. And the thing is that actually that structured data is there. You remember that Metafilter said literally, go crazy, put in anything you want. But still, most of those people put in really predictable, easily dealt with data. Even on Facebook, which is about as structured as you can get on social. 60% of them still opt in to selecting a relationship status, which is just as constrained a field. And it's fine to just go ahead and mix and match. I mean, some things we know we really need to be structured about, and some things we know that we can be a little more loosey-goosey. So it's about looking carefully, asking more questions about where can we be freeing things up for people to be individualistic. And we'll find that right approach for the user. Pardon me. So the bottom line is that we want everyone to feel excited about the things that we build. We want them to feel passionate. We want users to feel like they're involved, that they're part of a community, that they're recognized for who they are within it. Data that's collected by coercive approaches, like those text fields, those checkboxes, it's got a real risk. We think we're getting real data. We think we're getting truthful data. It's bullshit. When people don't want to give us real data, or they're forced to select from things that they don't think fit them, they get all passive-aggressive about it. They'll make stuff up that's not because it's true of me, but because I want to distance myself as much as possible from your version of reality. Fake it up. So we think we have all this tidy data, and actually we have all sorts of misdirects going on in our database from people who are just, not okay with the way we're approaching it. So we're making these decisions. We think we've got nice, tidy data that'll lead to the right answers, and lots of that tidy data is just leaving us in the wrong direction altogether. So we've got these restrictive options, all those checkboxes and radios. We don't actually have to make them required. We don't actually have to be mandatory with all this. But that way that we set up the schema often embeds assumptions that these things are going to be restricted, that they are going to be predictable. And so as we develop, they become required, even though we didn't intend it. A field that's not allowed to be null is destined to be a field that's mandatory. A field that sets a really short length like this is an assertion that we already know all the reasonable values. 6 just happens to be the length of female. This is a migration that implies that the only choices are male or female. Transgender isn't a reasonable option. It's never going to fit. If you're transgender, you're going to wind up feeling very coerced, pushed. That's all we need to do. Do less. Less is more. Making this stuff flexible up front is optimizing for storage later. We can decide what's valid later after we find out what's common, what's developing, how people see themselves. So we use these discretionary fields, at least to start, at least to learn something. And we can leave it up to the user to decide whether they want to share with us anything about themselves at all. You can look at that. Seems redundant, right? If you've looked closely at a migration, this is default. So it seems pretty stupid and unnecessary. But doing this is an implicit communication to yourself, to your team. It's a statement of intent. It's documentation of design decisions. We mean for this to be something that can be a blank or a nil. So, relationship status. This is one of those ones that we figure we have a pretty good handle on. We even got some pretty sort of, modern stuff, right? Open relationship. This was from 3 years ago. And Facebook felt pretty confident in it. It was arguably, like progressive. Users gave a lot of pushback to this. They disagreed. And so Facebook had to start adding more. And once you see the more, you realize, yeah, duh. So Google Plus, when they launched, they adopted a lot of that list. They took out a couple of those, you notice. And they added that discretion, right? I don't have to say. When we allow users to identify their relationships with labels that are personal, that's being driven by people who are rejecting that user experience. It just isn't working for them. This works for a lot more. So, why do we think that some statuses are universal, consistent, knowable, and others are maybe, fishy, possible, edge cases, evolving, emerging? When we name a thing, we're creating the scope of it. Assuming the validity of fields' values get constrained as soon as we give a name to that field itself. Marital status. Suddenly some of those are ruled out. You're either defined by being married, unmarried, previously married. Some of these just aren't relevant for that. Whereas relationship status sets a different set of expectations too. You might be in a current relationship, but we still have these options that really aren't quite fitting those constructs either, because people's lives aren't arranged as simply as this. So we have to go through life experiencing many of these. We may be dating at one point, we may be widowed at one point or divorced. And then we start new relationships, and we don't just leave the old behind all the time. They're still part of our identity too. So if you change the name yet again, you're shifting the paradigm yet again and possibilities that that creates. There are really important differences in this one from the others. And that means we're making differences too in what we collect. When we name fields, we're creating specificity and we're creating constraints. And we're making our analyses stronger or weaker by doing it. So we figured, relationships are pretty mutually exclusive, right? One at a time? Nope. And it can really hurt to be required to pretend it is. Spot the fatal flaw. Open relationship. It's a one-to-many, right? This is Facebook conceding to half of the protest. This is just throwing in yet another label without really understanding what that label's meaning is. And we do that all the time ourselves in different ways. So there are some takeaways that I would like you to have today. First, that modeling that real world is complex, and it's okay that it is. That early constraints in the schema will net us crappy, misleading data. So we need to keep constraints out of the schema, at least at first, for our own benefit, if nothing else. We can be selfish about it. We can gather enough initial responses to do some data mining. Watch the data for a while, keep an eye out for some interesting trends that we never would have spotted if we didn't believe they existed at all. Make discoveries. So the data quality will improve because those lies are optional. We'll get data that's rich, specific, we get to discover, we get to adapt, we get to show that trust in people that makes them excited about trusting us. We get to make them feel good about themselves and being known. And their response to all that is engagement, passion about what we make, loyalty to it. I really love to have questions about this stuff because there's a lot of complexity, especially when you're dealing with social data. There's a lot of interesting stuff with data mining. I think a lot of times we think that we have to get this data not for ourselves, not for the users, but for some advertiser. Someone further down the line is going to require this stuff of us. And a lot of times it, in fact, is just the opposite. Social data mining is frequently depending more on behavioral analytics than demographic. So by watching people in what they do rather than what they say they are, we're actually getting a lot closer to the value. How can I help? What can I tell you? All right, well, thank you.